NeuroTracker is definitely something that was developed to optimize, people's performance, people's functions, and it's based on a few fundamental principles of how the brain works. Essentially, the interest started with how we deal with complex dynamic scenes. So how we deal with the world out there. Okay. You're walking in a crowd, you're going in traffic, you're driving, you're playing sports. These have specific demands on the brain. And your ability to process this, not only is it relatively complex, but actually is trainable, it's plastic. We can improve this process. And this is how we sort of develop the NeuroTracker principles. And then expose you to them in a certain way that makes your brain better at it, that makes you better at it. And the first thing we found was, when we did that, at first, your brain does get better at it. You do get better at it. So that's an important factor right there. So as you are exposed to this task, you actually improve these functions. That's the first question. First point. The second point is, when you improve these functions, or even the relative measure of this capacity in NeuroTracker, does it first relate to those activities that you're interested in? In other words, does it relate to sports activity? Does it relate to your ability to cross the street without getting hurt, making good decisions? Us and other laboratories have shown that even initial NeuroTracker scores correlate with decision-making processes. Well, these correlate. This has been shown with athletes. What has also been shown is that the higher you are on the scale of performance, in other words, if I'm an active sports person, or I'm active in sports, and I'm just a casual person, I do casual sports activities, if I'm an elite amateur, or if I'm a professional, this has a big impact on the initial scores, but also on the learning rate. In other words, so it does relate to the scale or the performance level that people are at. And the third real big question is, if I do get better at this task, at the NeuroTracker, does it actually transfer to something I did not train previously? Okay, because you're training on a NeuroTracker, so you want to have what we call this long-range transfer, not just getting better at NeuroTracker. And that we've shown also. In other words, if you actually train on NeuroTracker, you can improve on certain abilities, like your capacity to anticipate other people's body movements, to avoid collisions, for instance, and things like that. So that's quite critical. And it does improve this capacity. We've shown this in the elderly, for instance. In sports, we've shown that actually if you train people on the NeuroTracker versus training them on, for instance, video, in control groups where we have active control groups, we were training them on soccer plays and soccer videos for soccer players in the same environment in 3D and so on. And what we found is, by measuring them in what we call short-sighted games, where we do 8-on-8, where there's a lot of activity, and we can use good metrics for evaluating pass percentage success. We saw a significant difference, almost a 20% increase in performance in the NeuroTracker group, and no difference in the what we call the active control, or the placebo group. And this was rated, these scores, for instance, in this particular study, were rated blind by a professional soccer coach, so that we didn't introduce bias. So this kind of evidence is building up, and it's building up from our lab, but it's also building up from other labs, supporting the evidence that it's not just training on this technique, it's actually transferring into other benefits. Furthermore, you're also interested in how the brain changes. And so we've done work on that too, looking at how the brain, the brain activity can change in its neuroelectric activity, for instance. If we do, for instance, resting state measurements pre and post, we see, very positive signs of, the low frequency bands, which is, if you have too much power in the low frequency bands in the brain, that's not good. And if you don't have enough in the high frequency bands, that's not good either. So you need to sort of rebalance these functions or these brain activity measures. And that's the kind of thing we see also with the NeuroTracker training. So all of that's very positive. So how do we do this, really? How do we isolate these basic features that we call dynamic scene? So most of the work we do here, or a lot of the work we do here, involves using virtual reality. And the reason we use virtual reality is not just because it's nice and it has nice features and so on. It's really because it's a little closer. It has certain parameters and characteristics that are closer to the real life situation. If I'm in space, if I'm in the real environment, I see things moving. I have to track multiple elements. I have to integrate over a certain visual field. And I have a third dimension. I have a dimension where we're sort of integrating things in depth. Now, that's not just the capacity of the eyes to use information and put them together, for the brain to use information from both eyes and put it together, but that's also make multiple judgments simultaneously. And what I mean by that is to give you a simple example. If I have a moving sphere, a moving object, it moves at a certain speed. If it's translating, so it goes from left to right in a 2D plane, it goes at a certain speed, doesn't change. The same speed, if I take the object, I change the orientation in 3D, it's going further away on what we call the Z axis or the depth axis. It actually has less velocity on my retina. So I'm making different types of judgments, okay? In real life, you're dealing with all of these different kinds of movements. NeuroTracker supplies that, because NeuroTracker puts you in that 3D volume, 3D space volume. And that's the virtual reality component of it, if you will. Now, if you want a task that is transferable and is general enough, simple enough to be used by everybody, you just want to isolate those fundamental principles, which is to be able to track more than a single element, to do this over a certain area, to do this with varying speeds and directions and some randomness into it without having a specific knowledge base. And this is what, again, the fundamental property of NeuroTracker does. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to stop there. In fact, there's a lot of programs with NeuroTracker that combines resources that are required for specific activities or specific demands. So if somebody needs to control balance while he needs to maintain his awareness, his capacity to process what's happening out there, to make good decisions, you can combine that. We have programs to do that, where we combine this physical activity or physical demand with the mental processing, if you will, so that we can build the level of capacity that keeps this ability to process general information, but then has a little more specificity to it for a specific requirements, specific needs. And we do this with the sports, when there's sport-specific decisions to be made. We can do this with the elite forces when we're working with the military. And we can also do this with populations, such as people with attention deficits, for instance, or with people in learning a certain curriculum. So you enhance their attention capacity, you enhance their working memory, executive functions, but at the same time, in a general way, but at the same time you can develop the specific requirements for a given task if that is desired. Okay, so there's a build-up, and that's why we call it now the NeuroTracker Learning System. There's the core where the big gain and the big benefit is, and that in and of itself is sufficient to improve brain function and transfer to other things. But you can make it even more specific. So there's an evolution in the program, and this evolution is science-based. So essentially, when we have questions or we have ideas of how it could or would work, we have to put it to the scientific test, and that's what we do in a systematic way. We take one question, we address it, and we see how, what is the optimal training program that we can use? What is the optimal sequence that we can use for this population, specific population, or for these specific needs within a population? And this sort of defines, in a nutshell, the whole philosophy behind the NeuroTracker approach and the NeuroTracker program.